Almost nobody knows the real story behind this man. History remembers the brilliant author who created enchanted wardrobes, noble lions, and unforgettable worlds. But it often overlooks the quiet battles that shaped the wisdom behind every page he wrote. Millions have read C.S. Lewis, yet very few understand why his words continue reaching people decades after his death. The greatest lesson of his life was never hidden inside fantasy alone. It was forged through loss, doubt, war, friendship, and an unrelenting search for truth. One of the most surprising facts about Lewis is that the man who became one of Christianity's most influential writers spent years as a convinced atheist, believing faith belonged only to myths and ancient stories. Even more remarkable is the heartbreaking experience that would later challenge everything he thought he understood about belief, love, and suffering. Before this story ends, you will discover the deeply personal lesson that transformed his pain into hope, and why that lesson may change the way you see your own life. Along the way, hidden moments from his childhood, unexpected friendships, and remarkable turning points will reveal a man far more complex than the famous name printed on countless book covers. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from, and let me know whether you've ever read a book by C.S. Lewis. I read every comment, and I always enjoy seeing how people around the world connect with these extraordinary lives. The story begins far from the dreaming spires of Oxford and the worldwide success that would eventually define him. It begins in Belfast, Ireland, where Clive Staples Lewis was born on November 29th, 1898. Family and friends soon shortened his name to Jack, a nickname he carried throughout his life after insisting, as a young child, that everyone call him by the name of a beloved dog. It was a small detail, almost amusing, yet it hinted at a personality that refused to fit neatly into expectations. His father, Albert James Lewis, worked as a solicitor, while his mother, Florence Augusta Hamilton Lewis, came from an educated family and possessed a deep love of learning. Their home overflowed with books. Shelves stretched across walls, inviting endless curiosity. Lewis later remembered that he could hardly recall a time when he was unable to read. Those books became more than entertainment. They became companions, teachers, and doorways into worlds that seemed larger than everyday life. Imagine a rainy afternoon in Belfast. Outside, grey clouds drift over narrow streets while the wind whispers through the trees. Inside the Lewis household, a young boy disappears into stories of mythology, adventure, and distant kingdoms. Those quiet hours planted seeds that would later bloom into some of the most beloved works of 20th century literature. Yet the greatest influences on his imagination were not only books. Nature itself awakened something profound within him. Hills, forests, and changing seasons stirred a longing he struggled to describe. Years later, Lewis would speak of a feeling he called joy. It was not ordinary happiness. It was a deep, almost painful longing for something beyond immediate experience, a glimpse of beauty that vanished almost as soon as it appeared. Throughout his life, he believed this longing pointed toward a greater reality. Modern readers might compare it to catching sight of a breathtaking sunset or hearing a piece of music that somehow awakens memories you never knew you possessed. But childhood wonder rarely lasts unchanged. When Lewis was only 9 years old, tragedy entered his life with devastating force. His mother became seriously ill with cancer. Despite every hope, she died in August 1908. Her death shattered the emotional foundation of the family. Lewis later reflected on the loneliness that followed. Home no longer felt the same. Familiar rooms seemed colder, quieter, almost unrecognizable. Soon afterward, he was sent to boarding school in England. Instead of comfort, he encountered isolation and unhappiness. Some of his early schools proved harsh places where discipline often outweighed compassion. The transition intensified his grief rather than easing it. Looking back, historians frequently identify these years as among the most difficult periods of his youth. Yet hardship often shapes character in unexpected ways. Instead of surrendering to despair, Lewis retreated into imagination. Stories became both refuge and training ground. Alongside his older brother Warren, He invented elaborate fictional kingdoms complete with histories, politics, and unforgettable characters. Long before readers discovered Narnia, two brothers were already building entire civilizations through creativity alone. There is another fascinating twist that many people never hear. Although Lewis would later become famous for defending Christian belief, his teenage years carried him in the opposite direction. Influenced by intellectual trends, personal suffering, and philosophical questions, he gradually abandoned the faith of his childhood. By his own later account, he considered himself an atheist for many years. He admired reason and evidence above all else, convinced that religious belief could not withstand careful examination. Ironically, the very qualities that pulled him away from faith would eventually guide him back. Education continued shaping his remarkable mind. Lewis studied under William T. Kirkpatrick, a private tutor renowned for rigorous intellectual discipline. Nicknamed the Great Knock, Kirkpatrick demanded logical precision in every conversation. Every assumption faced questioning. Every argument required evidence. Lewis later acknowledged that this demanding education sharpened his thinking in extraordinary ways. It taught him not simply what to believe, but how to think carefully before reaching conclusions. That discipline remained visible throughout everything he later wrote. Whether discussing literature, mythology, morality, or faith, Lewis avoided careless reasoning. His readers sensed they were listening to someone who respected both imagination and intellect, refusing to sacrifice one for the other. Then, history intervened. In 1917, as the First World War consumed Europe, Lewis entered military service after beginning studies at University College, Oxford. Like countless young men of his generation, he found himself transported from classrooms to battlefields. Dreams of academic life gave way to the brutal realities of trench warfare. The contrast could hardly have been greater. Fields once filled with quiet countryside echoed with explosions. Mud swallowed boots. Smoke darkened the horizon. Every sunrise carried uncertainty. Every night reminded soldiers how fragile life had become. Lewis served as an officer in the Somerset Light Infantry. In April 1918, during the Battle of Arras in France, he was seriously wounded when a British shell fell short of its target. Several fellow soldiers were killed. Lewis survived, but the experience left lasting physical and emotional scars. War stripped away romantic illusions, confronting him with suffering on a scale few people could truly imagine. Yet even amid devastation, another curiosity emerges. The man who witnessed destruction firsthand would later become one of the 20th century's greatest voices for hope. How could someone who had seen humanity at its darkest continue writing about courage, sacrifice, redemption, and joy? The answer did not appear overnight. Recovery allowed Lewis to return to Oxford, where academic excellence quickly distinguished him. He earned outstanding results in classics, philosophy, and English, demonstrating extraordinary intellectual range. Professors recognized not merely intelligence, but remarkable discipline. Behind every achievement stood years of relentless reading, careful thought, and unwavering curiosity. Still, something remained unresolved within him. His brilliant mind could analyze arguments with remarkable precision, yet the longing he had experienced as a child refused to disappear. Beauty still moved him. Great stories still awakened mysterious desires. Ancient myths still carried emotional power that pure logic alone struggled to explain. Without realizing it, Lewis was approaching the greatest turning point of his life, a journey that would reshape his beliefs, inspire timeless books, and leave lessons about purpose, suffering, friendship, and hope that continue changing lives today. In the next chapter of his remarkable story, unexpected friendships and unforgettable conversations would challenge everything he believed possible. Today, 10:12 p.m. make part 2. Returning to Oxford after the war, Lewis entered a world that seemed peaceful on the surface but was alive with fierce intellectual debate beneath its ancient stone walls. The narrow streets echoed with footsteps that had belonged to generations of scholars, while college courtyards carried conversations about history, philosophy, poetry, and the future of civilization. The air often smelled of old books, damp stone, and coal fires. In that atmosphere, Lewis flourished. His extraordinary academic ability earned him fellowships at University College, Oxford, and later at Magdalen College, where he taught English literature for nearly 3 decades. Students remembered him as demanding yet unforgettable, capable of transforming medieval texts into living conversations that felt surprisingly relevant. Despite his academic success, an invisible battle continued inside him. He remained fascinated by mythology, Norse legends, Greek epics, and the great stories of human civilization. These tales stirred the same mysterious longing he had experienced as a child, yet he still regarded them primarily as beautiful inventions. The question that refused to disappear was why fictional stories could awaken such powerful desires for truth, beauty, sacrifice, and eternity. Then came one of the most significant friendships of the 20th century. Among the scholars Lewis met at Oxford was a quiet, deeply imaginative professor named J.R.R. Tolkien. Long before The Lord of the Rings made Tolkien famous across the world, he and Lewis spent countless hours discussing literature, language, history, and faith. They became central members of a literary circle later known as the Inklings, a group of writers who gathered to read unfinished manuscripts, challenge one another's ideas, and encourage bold creativity. Picture one of those evenings. A fire crackles softly inside an Oxford room while rain taps against the windows. Papers lie scattered across wooden tables. Pipes send thin streams of smoke toward the ceiling. One writer reads a new chapter aloud while the others interrupt with questions, criticism, laughter, and encouragement. These meetings were not formal lectures. They were living workshops where some of the greatest books of the century slowly took shape. Tolkien played an especially important role in Lewis's intellectual journey. Together with another close friend, Hugo Dyson, he challenged Lewis's assumption that myths were merely pleasant fiction. Tolkien argued that myths reveal profound truths about human nature and that Christianity, unlike other myths, was what he called the true myth made real in history. According to Lewis's own later account, those conversations forced him to reconsider ideas he had dismissed for years. Lewis did not change his mind overnight. He examined arguments carefully, questioned assumptions, and resisted easy conclusions. But gradually, the evidence he believed reason demanded began pointing him toward a destination he had never expected. In his spiritual autobiography, Surprised by Joy, he famously described himself as the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. The remark carries a touch of humor, but it also reveals something deeply important. Lewis believed genuine conviction should never be forced. He wanted truth, wherever it led, even if it overturned his previous beliefs. That commitment to intellectual honesty became one of the defining lessons of his life. He demonstrated that changing your mind after careful reflection is not weakness. It is often a sign of courage. Once his worldview changed, Lewis began writing with extraordinary energy. His gift was not simply intelligence. Many scholars possess remarkable knowledge. Lewis possessed something rarer. He could explain difficult ideas with astonishing clarity. He translated philosophy and theology into language that ordinary readers could understand without sacrificing depth. During the Second World War, Britain faced one of the darkest periods in its history. Cities endured relentless bombing. Families lived with constant uncertainty. Every air raid siren reminded people that tomorrow was never guaranteed. In those anxious years, the British Broadcasting Corporation invited Lewis to deliver a series of radio talks intended to encourage listeners wrestling with questions about morality, suffering, courage, and faith. Imagine families gathered around crackling radios during blackout evenings. Outside, distant aircraft engines echoed across the sky. Inside modest homes, Lewis's calm, thoughtful voice offered reflection rather than panic. He never pretended life was easy. Instead, he acknowledged fear while pointing listeners toward hope grounded in reason as well as conviction. Those broadcasts later became the foundation for Mere Christianity, one of his most influential books. Decades after its publication, readers continue discovering its pages because Lewis focused less on winning arguments than helping people think more honestly about life's deepest questions. One of his most memorable observations remains strikingly relevant today. You can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending. Although this wording is widely attributed to Lewis, scholars note that the exact quotation does not appear in his published works. What Lewis did consistently teach, however, was that every person retains the ability to choose courage, repentance, and hope regardless of the past. The popularity of the quotation reflects themes genuinely present throughout his writing, reminding us to distinguish between authentic texts and sayings merely associated with famous names. Then came the stories that would immortalize him. In 1950, Lewis published The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the first released novel in the Chronicles of Narnia. Readers entered a world where ordinary children stepped through a wardrobe into an extraordinary land filled with talking animals, ancient prophecies, impossible courage, and unforgettable sacrifice. Although the series contains clear Christian symbolism, Lewis repeatedly explained that he did not intend the books as direct allegories. Instead, he imagined how central themes might appear in another world. Children loved the adventures. Adults discovered deeper layers hidden beneath them. That remarkable balance explains why the books continue reaching new generations more than 70 years later. Lewis understood something modern storytellers sometimes forget. Great stories do not merely entertain. They awaken moral imagination. They invite readers to ask not only what happens next, but also who they themselves are becoming. If you enjoy documentaries about history's greatest minds, subscribe, because every week we explore the remarkable people whose ideas continue shaping our world today. Lewis never sought celebrity for its own sake. Friends described him as generous with students, loyal to companions, and happiest when surrounded by books, conversation, and simple hospitality. His home, known as the Kilns near Oxford, became a place where discussion flowed as naturally as tea poured into waiting cups. Visitors remembered warmth rather than grandeur. Yet another unexpected chapter was quietly approaching, one that would bring profound happiness, devastating heartbreak, and the deepest test of everything Lewis had spent decades writing about. The lessons he shared with millions were about to be tested, not in classrooms or books, but in the most personal way imaginable. That final journey would reveal whether his words about love, suffering, and hope could survive the reality of loss itself.